Merci. Jacques Lezra is professor of Spanish, English, and comparative literature at New York University and chair of the Department of Comparative Literature. His most recent book is Wild Materialism, The Ethic of Terror and the Modern Republic. He is editor of Depositions, Althusser, Balibar, Macheret, and The Lab of Reading. He has published articles on contemporary and early modern translation theories and practices. Freud, Althusser, Woolf. He is the co-editor of the English translation of the Vocabulaire européen de philosophie. Jacques Lezra is going to present to us a paper on Corpora Ceca, Discontinuous Sovereignty in Il Principe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I apologize for speaking the barbarous local language rather than either Italian or French, but I'll do my best to try to be as French and Italian as I can in English. Gramsci's arguments regarding the composition of Il Principe are well known. Here's the way they open and outline. Machiavelli's text, Gramsci says, renders the figure of the prince anthropomorphically, plastically, even artistically. This strategy makes Machiavelli's short book part of the modern age, as different in its argumentative procedure as in its content from medieval or early modern treatises on the education of princes, on the virtues of the good monarch, and so on. The modern prince proceeds in consequence on three levels, which Gramsci understands to correspond to three levels on which Machiavelli's work also operates. Gramsci describes, with respect to Il Principe, a historic shift from pre-modernity to modernity. He tracks in Machiavelli's book a shift from a scholastic logic to a mythography or a rhetoric. And finally, he takes from Il Principe the modern requirement to pass, and the means for passing, from the figure of the myth prince, conceived as an individual, to a conception of sovereignty imagined as an organism whose first cell is the political party. It's my intention today to focus on the relation between these three levels or modes of argument in Il Principe on the thoroughly irresponsible basis of an over-detailed reading of one symptomatic analogy from the last sections of Il Principe. These levels or modes of argument in Il Principe are, of course, imbricated with one another and form a set of mutually enforcing relays, history to rhetoric, rhetoric to logic, logic to history, in a series of permutations of surprising coherence. I think it is fairly controversial to suggest that Gramsci draws the organic or cellular conception of sovereignty characterizing the modern prince from the formal coherence or continuity, the systematic relay form among history, rhetoric, and logic that he finds in Il Principe, and not from the thematics of Machiavelli's work. However consequential it may be, and it is highly consequential, since on this description of the continuism of Gramsci's model, the conception of hegemony will turn out to be a logical function rather than or before becoming a political one. However consequential it may be, this principle of continuity does not obtain universally or continuously in the text of Il Principe, where a different disruptive set of effects is at work as well. One might be tempted to cluster these effects together and say that they are evidence that a companion principle of discontinuity rules Il Principe and the prince himself as well. But the symmetry of this structure would be deceptive in the extreme. The principle of discontinuity in Machiavelli is not a principle. It does not gather its effects into a set organized axiomatically around a perspicuous term or a function governing the class of effects and designating their concept. Discontinuities in Il Principe work instead like contingent indices or acts of ostension or of reference or of designation. They are disorganizing strokes of fortune, eventa. They are more like floods or earthquakes than like reasoned decisions. So if the thought that is at work in Il Principe does not represent the dynamic conflict between symmetrical principles, what does it represent? Let me first be clear on my terminology. I intend the notion of continuity in a fairly technical sense. It would seem nonsensical to claim for Machiavelli a proto-Leibnizian position. Natura non facit saltus meshes badly with the catastrophism that we find in Il Principe, where nature jumps about, society does as well, and the prince must somehow react to the predictable occurring of unforeseen effects in both domains. But neither natural nor social phenomena, which include unexpected earthquakes, plagues, floods, the whimsy of a bad prince, the spontaneous revolt of a people, and so on, neither of these are principally where Machiavelli's continuism can be marked. It is rather the coherence with which Machiavelli's argument is conducted that interests Gramsci, the highest example of which, the modern prince suggests, is to be found at the conclusion of Il Principe, where Machiavelli, I now cite, makes himself the people, merges himself with the people, si confonde col popolo, whom he is convinced with the preceding tract, whose conscious expression he becomes and feels himself to be, with whom he feels himself identified, medesimezza. It seems that the whole of the logical work, this is Gramsci, is only a reflection of the people, an internal reasoning which takes place inside the popular consciousness and has its conclusions in an impassioned, urgent cry. This autopoetic or reflexive merging of Machiavelli with the people that Il Principe has convinced of its theses and produced in consequence as a people, this autopoiesis involves, or so Gramsci's reading suggests, what we should call a strong continuity, signaled by the stress on identity, medesimezza, and on immediacy, un grido immediato. Machiavelli, his readers, and his work achieve an organic identity in and by means of Il Principe. Or, if we do not wish to make the point quite so strong, we may say that they're brought into similitude with one another, on the basis of which they may feel themselves to be reflections of one another, confused with one another, identical to one another. On this description, the functional differences between author, work, and reader are displaced or erased. An immediate, impassioned cry is the result, the affective expression of self-thinking, and we understand this cry to issue from reader, writer, and work as well. The strong continuity that Gramsci describes in Machiavelli, a reflexive medesimezza obtaining among the levels of the argument and among its modes of discourse, would seem on first glance to square badly with at least one principal thesis of Machiavelli's argument, the thesis that Fortuna is capricious, her actions unforeseeable, her domain of action uncircumscribable. But there's no requirement beyond a vague sense that decorum would prefer it so, that the formal characteristics of an argument bear any relation to the subject or contents of that argument. One can argue in dialogue against the primacy of voice in philosophy, or argue propositionally for the superiority of poetic diction as a way of conveying general human truths. So this lack of squaring between formal principle of continuity that Gramsci finds in Il Principe and the disruptions of Fortuna at work in Machiavelli's treatise is perhaps trivial, though I'm inclined to think not. That is, it's not trivial, mostly because in Il Principe, Fortuna is three things at least. She's, of course, first an anthropomorphism or an allegory of natural contingency. Her purview, the fields of natural phenomena and of human history. But what Fortuna designates with respect to our everyday existence, with respect to the everyday world in which the prince, his narrator, and his subjects work, Machiavelli's argument also registers as an unmotivated discontinuity in the rational scheme, in the continuity of Il Principe. Fortuna is thus, in the second place, the recognizable, seductive, and effective shape that Il Principe furnishes as cause, emblem, and instance of these discontinuities in the work's conceptual scheme. Finally, and in contrast, Fortuna is still again the name that Machiavelli gives to the set of logical and rhetorical operations, like stipulation, ordering, analogy, and so on, at work throughout Il Principe, whose function is to create medesimezza, similitude or continuity within the argument and among its discursive modes and levels. Fortuna, the great leveler, the goddess who produces natural and social horizontalities and lies behind the ephemeral verticalities of the socio-political sphere and of natural space, the figure who distributes sovereignty arbitrarily across the irregular field of human endeavors as an overflowing river distributes debris across a plain. Fortuna is also to be seized, seduced, forced, turned to advantage. She simultaneously falls without and within the purview of her operations. She's entirely similar to, but also utterly dissimilar from, the natural and discursive elements that she distributes. In the conceptual landscape that Machiavelli describes, the operation of Fortuna in the affairs of the world is the analog, the mythopoetic avatar for the dynamics of continuity in Il Principe. She is also the analog for the effects of discontinuity in Machiavelli's text, and for the concept, or the defective concept in a sense that we will see, of the relation between the two, between principle and effect, between multitude and hegemon. The lines in which Fortuna's role is treated most thoroughly in Il Principe are of course to be found in chapter 25, which treats the influence of Fortuna in human affairs and describes how that influence is to be resisted. You recall how the narrating or arguing I says, after a famous and famously personalized description of the proportion of influence that Fortuna has in the affairs of humans, that I compare fortune to one of those dangerous rivers, simile fortuna a uno di questi fiumi rovinosi, etc. What seems at stake here is the relation between the possibility of planning for a disaster, like the flood, and the capacity to confront it once it has occurred and to profit from the disaster. As to predicting when disaster will strike, here we are forced into paradoxical formulations. We can foresee that Fortuna will act, but not the conditions under which that will occur, its time or quality. Nothing can withstand the flood once it is underway, and no one can tell when or where it will strike, but a properly foresighted people will build channels prospectively across the countryside, set up dams and dikes, reinforce bridges, and so on, so that when the flood occurs, its effects are minimized. The properly virtuous man, and the prince a fortiori, is the one who, when the catastrophe strikes, is able to take advantage of the desolation to recognize or produce effects of order. From the non-existence or the destruction of the cultivated landscape, the virtuous prince will build a politically structured, fortified, conceptual landscape that installs and protects his sovereignty, a dwelling. This is, in short, the definitive spot on which the humanistic reading of Il Principe rests, the canonical reading advanced by Skinner, among many others, that argues that the prince's virtù comes from and is manifest in his capacity to profit from Fortuna's unforeseeable outrages. This characterological argument has a companion structural shape. Machiavelli describes two moments, the preparedness of the prince and the people for the unexpected, as well as the prince's capacity to act decisively in reaction to it. These moments are held together chronologically and conceptually by the narrative persona that Machiavelli employs, a narrator furnished with the capacity to point out this or that event, recollected or anticipated, and to draw analogies to it from which the reader, the prince, or the commoner can derive a practical lesson. Between the prince, whose virtù consists in part in seizing the opportunity afforded by the unforeseen but predictable disaster, and the narrator, whose persona coheres precisely inasmuch as he can seize from history and circumstance cases to transform into examples from which he can provide continuous analogies that cut across time and conditions, between these two figures, something like a second-order likeness is established. Unstated, this second-order likeness underwrites the strange organic mimetism at the heart of political patronage. The prince to whom Il Principe is directed draws his authority from the lessons provided by the secretary, who in turn draws his livelihood and authority from the prince he counsels. It is a compelling account, this humanistic account, as its persistence suggests. On one hand, the prince as individual, on the other, the narrator as prince. Each is a figure for the other. Each guards the other. Each serves as the basis on which the other stands, his suppositum. Machiavelli's continuous logic in the chapter on Fortuna is quite different, however. The sovereign is himself, inasmuch as he is supported against Fortuna's uncertainties by the continuity that the narrating instance of Il Principe provides. The narrator of Il Principe is constant to himself, inasmuch as he is in turn protected from Fortuna's hand by the grace of the sovereign who underwrites and patronizes his project. Here, Gramsci's autoriflessione works to the extent that a distinction is drawn between the identity of the prince and his narrator and their mere similarity. It is not a tautologous medesimezza that Il Principe installs here and throughout, but a relation of mediate similarity between prince and narrator, a mutual determination by Fortuna from which each takes the other's vulnerability to Fortuna as the suppositum guaranteeing his identity. It is this defective self-reflection, this second-order likeness, that anti-Machiavellianism reacts to tautologously, foreclosing psychotically the structure of mutual defective determination that Machiavelli has set in place in Il Principe. Hence the importance of the verb assimiliare and of the function, rhetorical as well as logical, of similitude and analogy throughout Il Principe, but principally here, where Fortuna steps onto the page. Of course, the function of similitude is classically to provide a comprehensible, pedagogical, even doxological, mythopoetic shape to a concept. The nature of this transference of attributes from the natural phenomenon to the abstract concept, from opinion to proposition, from doxa to logos, is not without controversy, in part because of the relation it proposes between individual experience and general truths. Can it indeed be that the opinion that multitudes derive from experience becomes naturally, gradually, continuously the truth of propositions, as if there were no discontinuity between statements made in one mode and in another? But in Il Principe, and in particular where Fortuna is concerned, matters are even trickier. For Fortuna is always most like herself when she is unpredictable, inconstant, constantly inconstant. In short, when she is least like anything we already know or anything we can foresee. Fortuna marks the very limit of similitude, and it is on this ground that the narrator's relation to Fortuna can be said to be like the prince's relation to Fortuna. The fortune of each stands in a similar, though specifically not identical, relation of similarity to that which has no similitude, the effects of Fortuna. The narrator and his prince are alike. They can suppose one another in being like what has no likeness. The continuistic logic of Il Principe turns on this moment. The limit of similitude lies within, but also designates and regulates from without the continuous field of similitude. But just what is Fortuna like in this case? I compare fortune to one of those dangerous rivers. Assimilio Fortuna a uno di questi fiumi rovinosi, right? Let's take the liberty of asking whether this famous analogy to Fortuna has the fortune that I suggested earlier. Let's ask whether this analog to Fortuna registers, as fortune herself does, both the unmotivated discontinuities in the rational scheme, in the continuity of Il Principe, and also is one of the set of logical and operations, like stipulation, ordering, analogy, at work throughout Il Principe, whose function it is to create similitude or continuity within the argument and among its discursive modes, and levels. Does our narrator's simile reasonably and continuously flow like a strange river between the decorous banks formed by commonly accepted, recognized doxological traditions of exegeses and comparisons, or does it overflow those banks unpredictably and catastrophically? Can the virtuous reader, prince or narrator, seize the opportunity of this catastrophe? Can we foresee it, plan out in advance the landscape of our eventual interpretations, secure a position of relative authority over the desolate landscape? Machiavelli's narrator is clearly doing his best to tie his simile to just this sort of doxological decorum. This is what the indexical exclamation "Questi fiumi rovinosi" intends, an ostensive gesture that links Il Principe's description of Fortuna to a well-known hydrography. But the simile works rhetorically, logically, not only because everyone is likely to have encountered an impetuous river, but also because the impetuosity of the flooding waters is a natural as well as a human character, a humanizing attribute of the volume of waters, an attribute both of the physical volume of the water and of the wrath of the river as a natural object. Placing the simile under the aspect of ostension, while at the same time personifying it, has the effect, paradoxically, of universalizing by means of the specific, Everyone knows questi fiumi. We've all seen one of them. We've all seen these furious rivers. We can distinguish them from those quiet ones over there, the Arno on most days. The rivers we see every day calmly flowing until Fortuna's hand turns the wheel and they rage across the land. And similarly, all of us have encountered impetuous neighbors or heard of impetuous monarchs or have done this or that impetuously ourselves. Machiavelli's ostension thus links the io of the narrative, already linked to the figure of the prince in the analogy that we've seen, to the experience of the reader. A considered rhetorical strategy with not negligible philosophical import, since it speaks to the way in which a collectivity is created ostensibly, on terms that bridge the natural and the human worlds, including the master term for narrative continuity in Il Principe, the ostensive index io, I, the first-person narrative instance. In The Prince, this normalized figure of the well-known river, questo fiume, works to give what one could call the rules of the dynamics of surfaces on which Il Principe is based. The political-logical surface of the work is continuous but irregular, like a geological body, with mountainous verticalities rising against the plain. The raging stream is also a figure for the political-logical structure of the argument, where verticalizations, relations of subsumption, abstraction, and generalization, exist as the mountains do in the distance, their destructive or constructive effects only revealed when Fortuna intervenes and makes manifest the work's dynamic difference between levels. But do these hydrological rules, these hydropolitical-logical rules, provide us with a way of determining the didactic content of Machiavelli's figure of the river, of establishing on what conditions each of these discursive domains becomes sovereign over the others, becomes the semantically explanatory principle for the others, and thus for the simile itself? This question seems local, but it is in fact structuring for the whole enterprise of Il Principe, inasmuch as it bears upon Il Principe's principle of ostension. It bears on the way in which Machiavelli's treatise does or does not succeed in referring determinately to a state of affairs from which the reading prince would derive a concrete historical analog for the matters he faces in early modernity. It bears also on the question whether Il Principe does or does not designate an indexical position for the writer, the I who stands before this prince, from whom, and as the secretarial continuous responsibility of whom, the discourse of the prince, Il Principe, emerges, and whose narrative instance might then be said to determine the nature of the analogic register. Finally, and as we'll see most consequentially, this little example bears on the way Il Principe imagines the relation between similitude and continuity in general. This entirely local problem, which concerns nothing but a cluster of famous raging rivers, lies at the heart of the prince. What fiumi robinosi is Io designating when he turns to them? One of them, as it happens, is a river that no one has seen, though many of Machiavelli's readers would have encountered it. It flows through Book 1 of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. The lines I have in mind are the lovely verses beginning Principio venti vis verberat incita corpus, etc. They were profoundly influential in early modernity. All of Montaigne's rivers flow from this source. Lucretius's argument to this point in the Rerum Natura concerns the nature of matter, as you remember, its composition, its principal attributes, whether it originates, and if so, how and under what conditions, whether matter can be said to pass out of existence, and if so, how and under what conditions. We are on the verge in the poem of the atomic and the alphabetical paradigms, introduced back-to-back some 100 lines earlier, but not yet fully discussed. Here, where his raging river flows into the poem, Lucretius wishes to establish the rhetorical and logical grounds on which he will proceed in an exposition that will concern those things in nature that are invisible. He will, in short, be not only arguing for a definition of the nature of matter, but arguing that we can know by analogy the component elements, the indivisible elements that lie beyond the sensible, by analogy to other phenomena and elements, apparently or manifestly invisible, whose effects reveal them, or which are revealed when they are looked at dynamically, for instance, in the slant light of a ray of sun. The impetus of atomic motion cannot be perceived by the senses, nor can the beginnings of a chain of material causes, but a wind, too, cannot be seen, nor can its elements be identified, the elements that make up air, which when at rest cannot be perceived, and yet its effects, the effects of these invisible elements, are manifest when the wind blows violently. We should imagine the wind to be composed of elements, Lucretius writes, in precisely the way that a placid stream is composed of the elements of water, whose nature is gentle, mollis natura, but whose mass and momentum become patent when the river bursts its bounds and, as Rouse translates, suddenly rolls in overwhelming stream, when a great deluge of water from the high mountains swells the flood with torrents of rain dashing through forests and whole trees, etc., etc. Let's agree, since there is no way of determining otherwise, since we do not have the good or ill fortune to know whether it is or is not the case, that the rerum natura was in Machiavelli's mind when he wrote chapter 25 of Il Principe, let's agree, since Fortuna allows the arrow of Machiavelli's Questi Fiumi to fall among other places just here in Book 1 of the Rerum Natura, let's agree that Machiavelli's river analogy works at least in part by referring to, or by echoing, or by designating Lucretius's great and famous lines. In the Rerum Natura, the river is a complicated thing already, and Machiavelli's reference to it, if that's what it is doubly so. Amazing. If only one had a microphone to replace the microphone that fails. Bon, I continue. In every case, I mean. Complicated river in the Rerum Natura. In Lucretius's poem, the river is not just a river, but also an analog to the wind, which is not just the wind, but an analog to the atoms. The principle of similarity is now manifestly cosmological. It crosses chronological periods, media, even substantial differences, atoms being indivisible and water not so. A strong naturalized version of the principle of continuity is manifestly in place. Accordingly, for Il Principe's narrator, Fortuna is like a raging river, and this river in turn is sufficiently like Lucretius's river to call it to the mind of Florentine readers contemporary with Machiavelli, and this Lucretian river is in turn like the wind, which is like the invisible atoms that constitute matter. That this chain of similitudes is increasingly far-fetched may not make any practical difference to Il Principe's argument. Questi Fiumi can refer to both a physical river designated indexically, doxologically by Questi Fiumi, and to Lucretius's river of wind and atoms. If one river flows into the other, or one takes the place of the other, the function and the logical coherence of the argument are maintained. But Machiavelli's indices do not quite cohere. Designating a physical, recognizable river turns out to be quite different from designating a tropic river in Lucretius's poem, a river whose analogy to the variable and overwhelming force of atomic flow depends precisely upon a suspension, if not the outright destruction of the semantics of designation. For alongside, and as a constant simile for the chain of natural similitudes that he offers to atomic motion, Lucretius unrolls the alphabetical paradigm that makes his poem itself, the literal composition of his poem itself, the highest example of atomic composition, as in the earlier verses, ut potius multis communia corpora rebus multa putus esse, ut verbis elementa videmus quam sine principis, etc. What matters here to Lucretius as to his reader Machiavelli is the distinction between the semantic level on which the Rerum Natura proceeds and the elemental, the literal level. Elementa verbis do not signify. Indeed, it is on the condition that they not signify, that they can be reused in other words. The letters of the poem are, in the ambiguous way that Lucretius's lines favor, corpora caeca, invisible bodies which are also blind to one another, to themselves and to all things. We see, videmus, letters differently from the way in which we see with our senses. Letters are not phenomenally like the water or the effects of water and wind. But since we are manifestly seeing videmus and audimus Lucretius's letters, it is their mutual blindness, the letters' mutual blindness, the the way in which their entering into relation is independent of their phenomenal qualities as it is of their referential function that de rerum natura intends. The elements of Lucretius's words blindly refer to themselves, but not on the basis of what the words mean or of what the elements resemble. Neither a principle of similitude nor a semantic principle governs the aleatory coming into relation of Lucretius's letters or the effects of these relations in the poem and for its cosmos. This bears on the second way in which these two rivers that Machiavelli and Lucretius use work differently. The hydraulics of the system are identical in both stories, in Machiavelli's and in Lucretius's. The impetuous movement of waters from the height to the valley with disastrous consequences. But this hydrogeography can be maintained only in the domain of physical surfaces. In the Lucretian text, the verticality of the relation between the elements of the name itself in which these literal elements are collected, and the phenomenon named is constantly but not predictably, not continuously disturbed. In the rerum natura, the torrential current in Lucretius' analogy atomizes the poem and disperses the constituent letters of the verse across the poem. The semantic register is simultaneously confirmed and destroyed by the acting out, by the instance of the turbulent decomposition that the work momentarily names. Verticalization may then be a principle, as continuity is a principle, but for Lucretius it produces contingent relations as well as momentary and reversible ones, and it is always and already accompanied by effects of de-verticalization at work in the acts of reading and writing that bring letters together to form semantic units and take them apart in ways that make operational, semantically as well as non-semantically, their relation to others. Natura facit declinationes. This is what makes Machiavelli's simile so extraordinary as a reading of Lucretius. In Il Principe, just here, it appears, the anthropomorphic figure of Fortuna is not herself subject to fortune. Fortuna presides over the contingent world without herself being an example of or subject to that contingency. Her mythopoetic status is the guarantee, the rigid guarantee, you might say, that Fortuna will always act in the world. But that guarantee is itself impervious materially to the aleatory atomization of Lucretius's poem. Fortuna's name is written inviolably. Her name cannot be unwritten or spelled out or unspelled. Fortuna has no elements. She is herself the elementary, indivisible, atomic form of matter. We might conclude then that Gramsci's initial insights with respect to Machiavelli's treatise were profound but misplaced. It is not the prince whose mythopoetic incorporated integrity becomes in modernity the political party, but, okay, all right, I speak very quickly now. It's not the prince whose mythopoetic incorporated integrity, but it is elemental Fortuna who governs in particular the topology of Il Principe. The narrative instance, the first-person narrative in which Il Principe stands, is no longer indexically definitive with respect to the field of its narrative. The instance of narration does not provide a principle of continuity for Il Principe because it is never the subject exclusively or determinably of its enunciation, but is always and unpredictably slipping into becoming the object of narration through the act of Fortuna. The same obtains as concerns the object of the discourse, the prince who flickers from standing outside Il Principe as its addressee to finding himself one of the elements of the discourse. This continuity in Il Principe, in short, is thus a structural effect or an effect of structure, a consequence of the work's constant recourse to what we can call defective concepts. So, I conclude. All right. What is distinctly and irreparably disruptive of the continuity principle in Machiavelli, of efforts to constitute Il Principe's discontinuity effects as a principled and continuous field, and of